I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange.
Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, a paranormal pop culture show with the Den of Geek network, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. I'm your host, journalist, author, researcher of all things weird, Aaron Sagers. You can also catch me as the host of the Netflix series 28 Days Haunted, and you can catch me on the Travel Channel and Discovery Plus show, Paranormal Caught On Camera. So let me tell you about the guests and the project we're going to be talking about today. This is an exciting one. I've kept an eye on this one for a while, and I'm happy that you guys can get it in your hot little hands. Issue 1 is already out. Issue 2 is right around the corner. So from the New York Times best-selling and award-winning co-creators of Something is Killing the Children, The Nice House on the Lake, The Department of Truth, and Powers, comes this ambitious non-fiction comic book experience depicting true stories of UFO abductions with an eye to capturing the strange essence of those encounters. And in this debut issue, published by Dark Horse Comics, James Tynion IV and Michael Avon Oeming presents true weird stories. These are tales of ordinary people encountering the strange and impossible, and they retell some of the most popular UFO and alien encounters, beginning with the infamous Betty and Barney Hill abduction. It's widely publicized. We've talked about it on here before. Really the first, if not the first abduction case, first widely publicized abduction case, went on to really shape and influence all future encounters. And the comic is Blue Book. And my guests today are artist Michael Avon Oeming and editor Greg Lockard. And bring these guys in. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining me today for a chat. And first, I really, like I said, I have been looking forward to this book for a bit of time, ever since I saw the Dark Horse announcement for it. And then I find out that it began as a Substack, and there's the subscription service. So I'm glad to have it in print form, but I'm also excited that it's been out there on the subscription service for a while. I want to learn a little bit about the evolution of this project and how each of you became involved with it. And Greg, why don't you begin? Because how'd you enter into the Blue Book comic?
My entering was pretty undramatic. James I've known since his days as a Vertigo intern, and he reached out when he was signing the Substack deal to see if I was available to edit the projects he was launching within that. So yeah. So he had Michael can talk about the origins more. Like Michael was already lined up and going before I was on board. So I was just excited.
Yeah. Mike, add to that the initial idea to make a comic based on both nonfiction events, but events in this high strangeness world that some people might see as fiction. Talk about
Yeah, it was a real dream come true, because it's the kind of project I've wanted to do for a very long time, to do a sort of non-fictional account of these things, like maybe in the style of the old Ripley's Believe It or Not, or kind of a Twilight Zone-y, or the old television show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, like just sort of present stuff and mix narrative with facts, but not actually adding anything to sort of glorify the story, to add in extra stuff, but to do a dramatic presentation of it along with the facts and stuff. I have always been into fringe, weird UFO mystery kind of stuff. And when James Tynion came out with his book, Department of Truth, it was like everybody's been trying to do the X-Files since the X-Files came out. And really, it's hard to capture that again. You just can't. And he kind of did it in this book, Department of Truth. Especially when you look at the UFO field and conspiracy field, a lot of it starts to sort of delve into like a consciousness thing and how we're affecting the events around us. And he really tapped into the book. And I just reached out to him and I was like, oh my God, this was amazing. And he had been a fan of mine from Powers, because I'm old and I've been around forever. And he had this opportunity at Substack and was like, hey, what do you think about doing Blue Book? And it was the kind of thing that the second he said it, not only was I in it, I just saw exactly what it would be. And it was exactly what James was thinking. Even the blue tone thing, it sounds pretty obvious, but it sort of became our compass for everything else. Like this sort of very simple, straightforward truth of the facts as present. And that blue color kind of almost reflects that feeling of it. So it was true kismet. It was one of those few things that really come along like lightning in a bottle. It's with the right persons, with the right people, working with our letterers, Adidia and Greg. Greg really keeps us all together because we're all sort of scattered brain creatives. You know, we need somebody who can wrangle us and put us together. So that's kind of how it all came together.
I feel like you just said so many things that made me excited, but also want to within arms. Well, just out of arm's reach, actually, are a bunch of vintage Ripley's Believe It or Not comics that we're talking about. Both, they did dip into ghost stories, but also other strangeness. And I had done a project called Ripley's Road Trip where we were kind of pursuing some of those odd things. But then on top of that, I have like an X-Files t-shirt on, and we will get into this, but a copy of the Betty and Barney Hill book, Captured. God. So this, I'm right here with you. I'm nerding out with you, and also was a big fan of Powers, so I was excited to see this. Right. So yeah, I think that's. And Greg, what was your interest in this topic? Oh, it sounds like Mike was firmly entrenched in the material already, but were you into it, or did you have to kind of dive into the deep end with James and Mike?
I've been into it. You know, I was cool enough to watch all the X-Files episodes alone on Friday nights in high school. So I was on board and have been on board. But yeah, so the depth and breadth of like Michael and James's knowledge is beyond me. So they give me books to read, and there's like an aspect of me learning, like being like your every man reader, every person reader, that someone just to approach it from maybe an eye of a non-expert is what I try to do. But yeah, I learn with every new chapter, I'm learning something new, and definitely getting more and more pulled into it for sure.
Yeah. And it's an important role to play, because when you get into this material, it's so easy to get into the material so deep that you don't see the sort of the everyday Joe's perspective on it. So that's necessary. Just out of curiosity, what books did they give you to read? What were they saying? Be familiar with?
Oh my gosh, I haven't finished it yet. What's that massive report?
I think it's the Richard Dolan book.
The Richard Dolan book, yes. Yeah. I dipped out, and I obviously haven't dipped back in a while. But I was working through the Dolan, and then we were kind of on hiatus. Yeah, I don't know what's going to be next. What's next?
I mean, I think the next thing. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about the next storyline. But as far as the research goes and what Greg has to read, like it's not quite as important that he understands sort of like all the players in the UFO stuff, but like we're dealing with government documents in some cases. We're dealing with a hierarchy of military. Like I've had to draw, I don't know anything about the military, so like and I have to draw like Air Force people. I'm like trying to figure out like what their costumes are and stuff. There's just time stuff, like references for this is 1950s. Betty and Barney Hill takes place northeast in I forget
New Hampshire,
right? So there's a lot of little material like that I'll have to bump back and forth with Greg. Recently we had a really really weird thing where we're I guess these aren't big spoilers, but we're touching on like the Maury Island stuff, and some of the players in this look exactly alike, And then there's weird stuff where one of them, like Fred Crimson, shows up as one of the 3 hobos that gets wrangled up in the JFK assassination. Like, and then you're just like, wait, is this real? Do I have the right person? You know, and like sometimes you just need Greg to touch reality for us, you know, because it gets so weird and strange and you get lost in the minutia of it, and you need a clear set of eyes to guide you through it.
And sometimes if determining what is reality is the tricky point, like with all of this stuff. The Hill story, the Hill case, and I was talking to Greg a little bit backstage that even though I've been familiar with it for a long time and fascinated with it, I only just recently, back in November, went to the stretch of road where it took place, and there's a monument there and everything. And I love and I'm fascinated by this story, but I was curious as to why you guys as a creative team decided to begin with the Betty and Barney Hill tale. Mike, do you want to begin with that, or?
Sure, I'll take it. It sort of kicks off, you know, our modern ideas of UFO sightings and abductions. It really starts with the whatever's going on out there, whether this is some sort of human perception thing, whether it's really real or otherwise. This is the beginning of our cultural's perception of it, and these sort of landmarks that happen along the way in there, from, you know, the sort of mind control stuff, the lost time. The alien presence is really interesting because this would get into a much larger, geekier conversation about aliens and stuff. But I'm fascinated about how it changes over time with society. One of the big challenges that I had when I was drawing these guys, the aliens that appear in the Betty and Barney Hill story, aren't exactly the big-headed, large-eyed creatures. I mean, they have larger eyes according to what Betty and Barney saw, large almond-shaped eyes, but they weren't as exaggerated as they become in time. So it's interesting to go back to the roots of this story and then see how it sort of it changed over time. Not their story, but the way that the stories have changed through culture. So, and I think it was important to start here because not only is it the first sort of modern versions of this, the Hills themselves are very convincing. They went through all kinds of hell at the time. You know, of course, imagine in the 50s, like the way you get mocked now, but imagine in the 50s coming out and saying that you were abducted by aliens or you had this thing. You're going to lose your friends, you're going to lose careers, you're going to lose all kinds of stuff. Not only to mention that they were an interracial couple during that time period, or both involved or right stuff. They had just a lot going on and a lot to risk, you know. And people will say, oh, they wanted to sell books or whatever, but you know, that is never a guarantee. Like, you know, Greg and I can tell you, like, we're constantly trying to sell books and make movie deals and film deals. And like, they don't just fall out of trees. This isn't something you can just manufacture and go, oh, well, I'll make up this story and then we'll get like millions of dollars from blah, 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 you know. And the Hills were also very open about that. Like, they didn't make billions of dollars off of it. You know, they bought like new furniture, and I think they just upgraded their homes and stuff like that. Like, there's these chapters where they talk about what they did with the money and how they shared it with, I think, the therapist or somebody like that. So they're very convincing, and it's the beginning of all of this. So I think, going back to your question, that's why it all sort of, it was important to start there.
Yeah. There's this moment at the beginning of the book, first couple panels, when they're in the diner on the way back from their vacation. And I appreciate this moment because they're getting strange looks as they're walking through this diner. And it's very subtle. It's not overplayed, but I like it because I feel like there's not really enough focus on the interracial marriage of Betty and Barney Hill. I mean, maybe we talk about it now more, but these people did not want attention. I mean, they wanted attention for civil rights, which they were activists for, but not attention for this, which would detract from their activism.
And yeah, because they never crossed those lines. They would never sort of bring those two up, you know.
And it wasn't even their choice to tell this story initially. It was ripped away from them. So I find that I really just appreciate you kind of touching on that. So you're approaching this factually based on their accounting and and the books that have been written about them with their consent. But Greg, from your process, did you end up listening to the Hill's hypnosis tapes at all?
Yes. Yeah. I did out of curiosity because I had not listened to them prior to this experience.
And you heard him, Mike, right?
Yeah.
So Greg, coming into this, what was your reaction to hearing those tapes?
I mean, it's pretty haunting. I'm pretty open to these type of. I'm usually on the side of believing, the people tell you, and they're pretty convincing to me, at least.
Sounds horrendous to me. I mean, I
Yeah.
never get over just the sounds of them as they're describing what they were experiencing. Greg, this is entertainment. It is a factual representation, but it is entertainment. So, and from both of your perspectives, but starting from the editorial perspective, how do you balance the entertainment while being true to the story without moving into the over sensationalized elements?
Yeah, I think James and Michael were both like conscious of that going into, because it's very delicate, and like there are elements of those violations that, especially when you're doing a comic book, because it lives in the art, and the art is a static image. Whereas if we were recreating this in film or TV, there's a moving image and there's other things you can do. But yeah, you have to be really, really careful and sensitive when you're recreating these scenes, for sure. Mm-hmm. And they were. Michael can talk about it more, but
yeah,
definitely were.
Yeah, add to that, Mike.
One of my favorite parts of doing this book was, I was aware of their stories before that. But as I'm reading their stories, and you read what they went through, like specifically how, like, Betty was kind of framed as, by doubters, as like this Machiavellian person who wanted to be famous, and she manipulated her mentally not as strong husband into, like, they basically said she incepted him into believing that this thing happened, right? Like, so there's all kinds of layers of really just horrible social stuff going on top of there, right? So like that was stuff I started to realize as I was reading about their story. But the really, really interesting thing was as they became more real people to me, as opposed to just a story, I also started to realize like they were around the age, I guess they were technically old. They must have been older, but they reminded me of a lot my older family members. They come from like the World War II generation and stuff. So that started to inform like the way they, like, I see these pictures of Betty, and she's like in basically her bingo outfit, right? Like, big oversized t-shirt, and she's like smoking a cigarette, showing where the alien thing came and stuff. And she just started to become so human. And as I was reading about Barney, and like Barney, he had a son who he couldn't see very often. He had this crazy job that as a postal guy who was like, he was traveling like 2 hours a day or some crazy stuff like that. And so he was under all these pressures. And I just started to relate to them in like this almost family-like layer, not to mention that they have family who are still living now. So A, I wanted to make sure that they were represented well. B, they started to become like real people to me who I could relate to the point, like when the story ends, like I was a little teary-eyed, and I think James did a great way of finding an end to the story, to a story that doesn't really have an ending. Because without having to create anything, I think we just sort of let their characters and personalities come alive in the book, whether they're true to who they were or not. I think it's a nice homage to them as people. And I would hope that like in the great UFO cloud up in the sky, they're like, okay, you guys did it. You that wasn't bad.
What were some of the bigger swings that you had to take artistically? I mean, you said that, knowing what someone in the military might be wearing is one thing, but you are having to interpret descriptions and yes, their own sketches. They're kind of not great sketches, quite honestly, of what they saw. And then you're having to bring it all into life or bring it onto the page. what were the biggest artistic swings you had to take?
Some of it was trying to just be accurate, right? There was that fascinating story about the star map where Betty had seen this book that had the description of I forget which star constellation it is.
Zeta Reticuli.
Yeah, this is where we get the famous Zeta Reticuli thing from. And there were all these sort of maps, and after I'd drawn it the first time, I realized that part of the map there were different kinds of lines drawn between the stars. Some were solid lines and some were broken lines, and they meant different things. So like, even though this is a really, really tiny detail, this is the kind of thing I was trying to capture. Also remembering everybody smoked back then, but I also didn't want to make it like a smoking comic either. But like, so there's all this little stuff, make sure that the cars are right. That was a big challenge for me because I'm terrible with cars. Another challenge, like I said, was the aliens. The aliens were described differently. They were much more human-like. And I think I did let that go a little bit. Like I couldn't help, but like the iconology that we're so used to now with aliens got more and more closer to modern aliens than what they had actually described. I think the only thing that I didn't do purposefully, the only thing I really left out was there was in Betty's memories, which I think were, they were all kind of mixed up because of the way it was done. She had memories of one of the aliens having like a captain's hat on. And I was like, I am not drawing that. Other than that, I had to figure out there wasn't much description of like the inside of the ship. There wasn't much description of their outfits. She did kind of draw like they had this sort of like chevron-y kind of thing at the top. And I don't know if she was just winging that or not. So yeah, it was difficult to be as close as you can as possible. And also with the medical examination stuff, to how do we show some of this with also not being, embarrassing or crude,
Right.
But also showing that it was dehumanizing at the same time. So it was a real mixed bag of challenges. It was a lot of fun because there's no punching in this comic. There's nobody leaping through windows or the other sort of dynamic stuff you can typically play off of. So, the physical acting, the emotions through faces, dynamic shots of the car being chased by UFOs and stuff was a lot of fun to be able to lean on like just hardcore storytelling. That's all cake and no icing. So that was a lot of fun.
Were there elements of the story that you wanted to include and just had to make some, other than captain's hats aside, that you wanted to include, but just had to get put on the chopping block and couldn't work it in? Greg, is there any that you can think of?
I was going to ask Greg if he was aware of earlier drafts that might have had some scenes.
No, I think, Michael and James are both really good at knowing, like the storytelling beats are pretty, at this point, I think in both their careers, it's second nature in a lot of ways to the way they look at pages and stuff. So I think James is pretty secure in like knowing where the story needs to end to give you, like Mike was saying, that moment of like, it's not the end, but it's somewhere in between the abstraction of we don't know what is going to happen and optimism that this may be.
It's a bit of a fairy tale ending. It feels like rooted in the reality that we know, and then we reach this almost dreamlike conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was curious, and I hate doing this. I'm not trying to do this as a gotcha question or whatever, but there's this component to the story of Betty's dress, and she had a physical dress and she just had to get it off and wanted nothing to do with it and was grossed out by that. I don't know if you're familiar with that or if there was a specific decision to cut that out, or if there's nothing there, that's fine. But I didn't know if you were aware of that or had any thoughts.
Well, there was, from what I remember, so yeah, there was, during the examination, they cut off part of the dress, or that she got something on the dress that would bring back some form of proof or something. And I know that the dress was tested. And we cover not the dress, but like the car had become magnetized. Mm-hmm. So there were these aspects to it. I think a thing with the dress is like, there's just so much speculation around it about like, because they weren't like CSI wasn't taking this stuff apart, you know. So I remember that stuff, and it was, we didn't have a conversation about it, but I know it just would have been difficult to figure out. Like, it becomes like more of a curiosity than anything else.
Right. It's easy for these things to be like a detour. And then once you go down that detour, either you keep following it or it feels incomplete, I suppose.
Yeah, like there's a whole section in there where Betty has a gun. I mean, most people in the 50s had a gun, you know, and if you're traveling, it wasn't like it's a very different landscape than today.
Is it?
Well, you know what I mean.
Unfortunately,
just mentioning it is a thing, right? So, but they had the gun with them, and Barney has a memory of retrieving the gun, but he doesn't have a memory of what happens with it after that. And there's these weird layers of mixed memory stuff. And the thing is, you can go down those rabbit holes because there are times where he would talk about it and other times where he wouldn't. There's those strangers that they saw on the side of the road that might have been a screen memory for something. And I think James did a smart job, and you don't want to answer everything. You want to leave some of these mysteries. And by answering, I don't even mean having an answer, but just sort of addressing it. Like sometimes it's best to have something just weird happen and like, yeah, we never figure out what that's about. Because there's so much of this is like that. You just don't know what it's about. I mean, I've been studying this field really since I was a kid. And I know less now than when I feel less sure about what's going on now than when I started.
Was there, and correct me if I'm wrong, compared to your other work, I think this is the first time that you're dealing with subject matter that really for decades has been digested and represented in other media. And even recently there was the Project Blue Book series, the live action, and that was heavily scripted, fictionalized version of it. But was that a challenge at all in approaching this thing that people are sort of aware of from a cultural osmosis standpoint, or have recently watched the show and now you're going to do your take on it?
It really, I think, Greg, tell me if you agree with this, like it was almost easier because there was so much sort of Hollywoodization, if that's a word, of the fields, you know, to just go back, to strip things back to, you know, these were the reports by the Air Force. These were the reports that people were going through at the time. Like to just peel back all these layers, like when you saw like Fire in the Sky, right? Great film, and I loved it. But most of it is made up. What happens to him inside the ship is all this like horror stuff that's you need it for. Well, I would argue you didn't need it for the film, you know. So really just pulling it back and making it simple and about their experiences as people, I think is more relatable and stronger than, you know, getting into Lights in the Sky and, you know, all the technical aspects of like, well, you know, was this recorded on FLIR or was this recorded on this thing? Or, you know, what did this member of the government said? Just stripping it down to like just the human experience. Mm-hmm.
So looking ahead, I mean, look, we're early in the Blue Book run, and you've got a lot of chapters ahead of us coming out in the Dark Horse comics. But talk a little bit about the other Blue Books or other high strangeness stories that you guys are going to be getting into and what you would like to get into. I know over at the Substack, you've started the Kenneth Arnold story, right? So, Greg, why don't you start with that? Talk about other cases, what's ahead, and what you would like to get into.
Yeah. Right now in the Substack, we're working. Yeah, we're with Kenneth Arnold in the late 40s, and we get into. I guess none of this is spoilers, right? Technically, it's historical documents. And then, we get into Roswell soon. And then, I think, Mike can talk about it more, but there's from what I've seen of publishing plans, there's lots of chapters of Blue Book ahead of us.
Yeah, right now I'd say like between the Kenneth Arnold, I mentioned Maury Island earlier, and then of course we'll obviously at some point do Roswell, but there are several other really big cases with lots of witnesses, cases with lots of government witnesses, get into. So I mean, we have, like, right now we probably have about 2 years worth of stuff planned out, but I mean, we could keep going because of the depth of it, and especially because the public doesn't know about, you know, Rendlesham Forest, or, you know, what happened in Poughkeepsie, and, you know, this kind of stuff. And then there's all the neat stuff that Greg could talk to. It's about the extra weird stories that we're doing, which I love that's in here too.
Yeah, I want to hear a little bit about that, Greg. These true weird stories that you're going to be talking about, and these appear in the single issues. There's the Coney Island story, which is a great story, by the way. I love that one. But speak about what you have planned on that front.
Yeah. The True Weird is like an anthology series that's going to run alongside Blue Book, and kind of, you know, it's similar in tone, and it's also historical nonfiction comic book work. So we've been recruiting other writers and artists that are like-minded souls, and asking them for the stories that excites them, whether it's, you know, regional stuff. We did one in Canada with Zach Davidson and Gavin Fullerton, you know, like last year in the Substack. And Genevieve Valentine did Ectoplasm with Ming Doyle, and let's see. Oh, and Aditya, the letterer of Blue Book, is also a writer, and he wrote about the Monkey Man in India that happened, that Aditya lived through at the happening of that. So there's been a lot of fun stories that, you know, are pretty personal to people, or people are really passionate about, kind of like James and Michael on Blue Book. And yeah, it's just really fun. So yeah, it's lots of artists and lots of writers and different perspectives. So yeah, those are running as short stories in the Substack, and then they will go as like backup material in the Blue Book series, and then they'll be collected separately as their own, like, trade paperback graphic novels later.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, no.
Yeah. It's really
totally down for that. That's very cool. Do you, Mike, I don't know, this just could be a Wikipedia fact, but I've heard that you are a fan of ancient mythology, and I was just curious what your thoughts were on sort of the ancient astronaut ideas and those notions.
You know, I've really come to the conclusion that like a lot of what I think is pretty common sense in between the fringe world and the straight world, let's say. But the wackiest thing that I believe, the fringiest sort of woo that I could kind of take a stand on, is that we probably are in some sort of consciousness-driven universe, whether our brains are receptors for wherever we really are, or that, you know, time might not be linear, but that we perceive it so it's organized in this way for us, and in some way through our consciousness, which would explain the weirdness, the inconsistencies. And if you've talked to people who've had these experiences, like if you know anybody that you love and trust who've had these experiences, it's hard to say, oh, you are seeing things, you know? So I think that there's something going on that's very, you know, Jungian, that just taps into a sort of not a universal consciousness in like a crystal, you know, tie-dye kind of way, but, you know, in the way that like people will have the same ideas at the same time on other sides of the planet, right? Cultures will develop similarly because of survival instincts and what it means to be afraid of the night, or what it means to hunt. And like you start to develop the same sorts of ideas everywhere, and very much like Joseph Campbell sort of way. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, maybe these things are a little more literal. Like, you know, we have been influenced by aliens or angelic figures, or, you know, larger pan-dimensional intelligences or something. I think the universe is so weird that it's possible it could be any of that, you know, or that none of this is even happening right now.
I don't, I mean, obviously I don't know, but it's fascinating to me as a student of all this high strangeness as well as folklore and things like that, how people of different cultures, different pockets of the world who never had any crossover were developing these same notions of, I don't know, for instance, like they might be called leprechauns in Ireland, but every culture has some sort of version of like a mischievous, little person, and a lot of times dressed in similar ways, like or other things, goblins and whatnot. So there does seem to be something that's connecting our consciousness. It's also how we manage getting a couple volcano movies at the same time. But are you guys finding now that you're entrenched in this world, along with the actual headlines that have been coming out for the last few years of the New York Times and press briefings of the White House involve people asking about UFOs? Is this a topic of conversation in your non-creative hub, or people bringing this up in your normal day-to-day life? Greg, over there in Jersey City, are people talking about aliens to you now that they know you're working on this?
Not if I can avoid it. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, like, I mean, I've always been like a believer. Like, I mean, everyone in New York's lived in a haunted apartment, right? So that sort of stuff. I've been a believer, and I've been talking about that stuff for a while. My friend group probably leans more towards nerdy and witchy and all that stuff. So yeah, it's always around for me, luckily.
And Mike, I forget where you're based. Portland?
Yeah, right now I'm just outside of Portland.
Yeah. Great weirdness hub, and obviously
definitely.
lots of alien as well as ghost and Bigfoot talk. But how about you? Is it popping up in your conversations?
You know what's weird? Like in the creative community, I think people are much more just fascinated by this stuff and caught up into it, as opposed to taking a stand and believing things specifically. Like when I talk to James, he has a similar thought that I do about this stuff. And like it, honestly, it wasn't until maybe 5 or 6 years ago that somebody literally asked me, "Do you believe in aliens? That aliens are visiting us?" And I was like, "Oh wait, I don't know." But I love the story. I believe in the stories and like all of that, like, and then it feeds into my creativity and stuff. So I have this weird creative objectivity to it that makes it confusing as soon as I actually think about what I do believe in and don't believe. The interesting thing though is like when you read Blue Book, you'll start to see what's happening right now with the UAP reports and all this Air Force stuff. We've been here before. This is just history repeating again. And like you get the same messages out of the government that first they'll say it was this one thing, and it's always a balloon. That's what Roswell was, right? It was like first it was aliens, next day, oh wait, I'm sorry, we didn't mean aliens, we meant a balloon. It's a weather balloon. Yeah. And now we have the balloon things going on, and we have like official videos, and then they'll walk back, and it's all weird, man.
What's curious to me though is that we're also now in this time where people have the ability to, they're capturing it themselves, and the message is harder to keep contained. And even like in the 90s, there was strange happenings in Michigan, and there was enough people. I mean, Michigan is very weird, but you couldn't keep a lockdown on the information. It was just kind of spreading out. So now it's not just a controlled government messaging, and whatever it is.
Yeah, and without any sort of conspiratorial end of it, it does seem that there are people inside the government who want to talk about this stuff, and others who don't want to. And whether it's true or not, or it's all just sort of smoke and screens to keep internal secret and stuff, there does seem to be some sort of willingness for somebody on the inside to start talking. And it is easier now for people to start speaking because of, social media and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Maybe something will change. We'll see.
Greg, you mentioned everyone in New York having lived in a haunted apartment, and actually I don't hear as many, and I look for these stories. I don't hear as many haunted apartment stories in New York as I would like to hear. I think maybe people are just caught up in their lives and not paying attention. But is there something about this notion of extraterrestrials, especially as you're editing these books, editing these issues, is there something about this notion of extraterrestrials that is more unsettling to you than a notion of a ghost? Or are you more afraid of the notion of the ghost as opposed to the alien?
Well, I'm more afraid of the alien, having not yet been abducted or encountered them. I'm still holding out. But yeah, I think there's something, because, our whatever they are as a representation of our fears or and the different ways we've translated like people's visualizations of them, I think they are inherently a little more scary than a ghost to me. That is usually more humanoid or like we can picture the scene more. Like if it's like the haunted apartment, I knew that it was someone else that lived there, most likely.
I mean, like from a psychological standpoint, I guess a ghost is us, just in a different form, unresolved.
That's what I was
issues
towards.
And
thank you.
But similar emotional states of being at some point. Whereas an alien, we don't know what the hell is going on with that. I don't know. Aliens freak me out more. I mean, I think it's probably their turn to take the wheel from us for a bit, but they kind of freak me out.
Yeah.
But Mike, what is your thought? Is any of this, when you really think about it, when you look at that gorgeous star-filled Portland sky, is there any element that's just beyond the awe and the wonder that might come across as a little creepy and unsettling to you?
I mean, I think all of those phenomenons are kind of cousins of the same thing. If you look into the UFO phenomenon, there's a lot of that sort of like trickster element, and you definitely get that when you get into ghosts and the spirit world as well. So I kind of wonder if it's all sort of the same thing. I do hope that my wife and I get abducted though, because I always say if we get abducted, like I've got my mind trained to get them to cure her MS for her. So like that's my goal is like, we haven't seen anything yet. We've been out to the stars. We've been out to this really weird place out here called Mount Adams, which there's all kinds of weird stuff. We haven't seen anything. We're trying. We're open-minded. But that's my goal. Like, let's get abducted so we can get you fixed.
And look, I think that the nerds we're the ones that are set up to be abducted and have these experiences, because when you've already lived a life in this kind of sandbox of imagination and reading about it and thinking about it and everything, that when the moment happens, you'll be like, okay, so it's happening. All right. So now and the fact that you've mentally thought about, like, I'm going to think about this message to send to them telepathically to help my wife. Like, you've got the plan. You've done the prep work.
I want something practical out of it,
Yeah. So, well, what if they wanted you to? What if they're like, because there are the stories that it's like, all right, well, you could come with us. Would you go? Would you take the one-way ticket?
Only if Taki can come with me.
I think that's an automatic yes. Of course.
Oh yeah, then we're out of here, man.
Yeah. All right.
I'm sorry, Greg. We won't meet that deadline.
I know. I was going to say.
That's okay. I'm
going to be terrible for the comics industry.
I know.
Unless they've got a really good broadband on Zeta Reticuli. Well, guys, I really appreciated this conversation, and I love hearing your different perspectives on it. And I love Mike. I appreciate how you're just such a deep in the weeds nerd, and Greg, you're like definitely coming along in this as well. So, in the next single issue of Blue Book comes out on March 23rd, I believe, out of Dark Horse. And meanwhile, you guys also have the Substack. And give me the address for the Substack one more time.
It's Tynion IV.substack.com.
Gotcha. And meanwhile, I'm really looking forward to it. And hit me up, guys, if you need someone to contribute some stories for you of this weird stuff. I will add to the true weird tales. But in the meantime, once again, my guests today are Michael Avon Oeming and editor Greg Lockard, and they, along with James Tynion, are the creative team behind Blue Book. And this has been Talking Strange. If you have stories you'd like to share of the strange and unusual, email us at talkingstrange@denofgeek.com. I'm Aaron Sagers, and until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.
Bye.